All right, so the American Civil War finally ends in 1865. You'd think the fighting was over, right? Well, not even close. The fight for the very soul of the nation was just getting started. And what comes next? It's a period called Reconstruction. And honestly, it's one of the most important, most controversial, and frankly, most misunderstood chapters in all of American history. And just weeks before he was assassinated, President Lincoln lays out this incredible vision. He says, with malice toward none, with charity for all. He's basically saying, look, no revenge. Let's not punish anyone. Let's just focus on healing, to bind up the nation's wounds. It's such a powerful, hopeful idea. But the problem was, those wounds were so deep. So let's talk about that promise and the monumental challenge that came with it. The entire country was staring down a set of questions that, well, had no easy answers. So what was Reconstruction, really? At its core, it was this 12-year stretch from 1865 to 1877 with two giant goals. Goal number one, how in the world do you bring the 11 defeated Confederate states back into the fold? And goal number two, which was arguably even bigger, what do you do about the 4 million people who had just been freed from slavery? What does their future look like? I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. It is a staggering question. How do you rebuild an entire country that just tore itself apart? And what does freedom actually mean for 4 million people? Is it just not being in chains? Or does it mean you can vote? Can you own property? Can you get an education? These weren't just philosophical debates, For millions of people, these were life or death questions. And as you can probably guess, trying to answer those questions immediately ignited a huge, bitter conflict. You basically had two sides. On one side was the federal government, trying to create this new, more inclusive definition of freedom. And on the other, you had a massive wall of resistance in the South, dead set on keeping the old racial power structure in place. And this right here just perfectly captures that conflict. It's like whiplash. On the left, you have the 13th Amendment, passed in 1865. Slavery is abolished, period. A massive leap forward for human rights. But then, almost overnight, the southern states fire back with these things called Black Codes. And let's be clear, these were laws designed to recreate slavery in everything but the name. And if you want to see just how bad they were, just look at this example from South Carolina. I mean, it's unbelievable. The law literally calls Black workers servants and their white employers masters. The exact same language. If you didn't have a job or a place to live, you could be arrested and forced to work on a farm. This wasn't a loophole, it was a systematic attempt to completely crush the idea of freedom before it even had a chance to start. So who were the main players in this dramatic struggle? Well, you had a few key groups. First, there's President Andrew Johnson, who took over for Lincoln. He wanted a super fast, super lenient reunion, basically letting the old Southern leaders back in with very few strings attached. Opposing him, you have the radical Republicans in Congress. They were absolutely furious about the Black Codes, and they wanted to punish the South and use federal power to protect the rights of freedmen. And then you had the Ku Klux Klan. This wasn't just some fringe group. It was an organized terrorist organization using murder, fear, and violence to restore white supremacy.
But here's where the story takes a turn. For a short, incredible window of time, the radical Republicans actually won the fight in Washington. They gained control and they pushed forward a truly revolutionary vision for what America could be, a vision they planned to write directly into the Constitution.
And this is it. This is the legal core of that radical vision. Think about this. 3 constitutional amendments in just 5 years. That's insane. First, the 13th, which we mentioned, abolished slavery. Then the 14th, which grants citizenship and equal protection under the law to everyone. And finally, the 15th, which says you can't deny someone the right to vote because of their race. This was a complete reinvention of what it meant to be an American citizen.
And I really want to zoom in on the 14th Amendment because it is the big one. It's the cornerstone. This was a direct shot, a constitutional missile aimed right at the Black Codes. It basically said to the states, nope, you don't get to decide who's a citizen anymore. We, the federal government, do. And that little phrase, equal protection of the laws, wow, that becomes the legal foundation for the entire civil rights movement 100 years down the road.
And for a little while, it actually seemed to be working. For the first time in history, thousands of Black men were voting. And not just voting, they were getting elected to local offices, to state legislatures, even to the U.S. Congress. It was this incredible, unprecedented experiment in interracial democracy. It truly looked like a new America was possible. But it was all incredibly fragile, and it wasn't going to last. And just like that, the dream began to die. That radical vision collapsed almost as fast as it appeared. Why? Well, it was a perfect storm, really. People in the North were getting tired of the fight, the violence in the South was just relentless, and it all came crashing down because of one single, shady political deal. That deal came out of the presidential election of 1876. And, as you can see from this map, it was a complete and utter mess. The results were so close, and there was so much voter fraud and violence, especially in the South, that nobody knew who actually won. It plunged the entire country into a massive political crisis. So how did they solve it? Well, not with a recount. They solved it with a secret backroom deal that's now known as the Compromise of 1877. Here's the deal. The Democrats would let the Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, have the presidency. And in exchange, the Republicans promised to do one thing: pull all the remaining federal troops out of the southern states. And that was it. That was the end. You have to understand, those federal troops were the only thing enforcing these new laws and amendments. They were the only ones protecting black citizens from groups like the KKK. Pulling them out was a giant, blinking sign that the federal government was officially giving up on Reconstruction. So, what happens next? What comes after this great betrayal? Well, what followed was nearly a century of brutal backlash, a systematic campaign to erase every single right that had been gained, creating a legacy that, frankly, we are still dealing with today. With Reconstruction dead, a new system of control rose up to take its place. It was called Jim Crow. These weren't just customs. They were state and local laws that forced racial segregation into every single corner of society. We're talking separate schools, separate hospitals, separate train cars, even separate water fountains and cemeteries. The goal was total separation. And what about the right to vote? The 15th Amendment was still there, so how did they get around it? Well, they got creative and they got cruel. They couldn't say black people can't vote, so they invented all these tricks. They created poll taxes, forcing people to pay a fee to vote, knowing most black sharecroppers couldn't afford it. They used literacy tests that were designed to be impossible to pass. And the most cynical one of all, the grandfather clause, which said you could only vote if your grandfather had voted before 1860, which of course excluded virtually every black man in the South. And the final nail in the coffin came from the Supreme Court itself. In 1896, in a case called Plessy v. Ferguson, the court made a shocking ruling. They said that segregation was perfectly constitutional as long as the separate facilities were equal. This infamous separate but equal idea became the law of the land, giving a giant legal green light to the entire Jim Crow system and completely gutting the 14th Amendment for more than half a century. So that brings us to the big question, right? Reconstruction only lasted for about 12 years. It was this brief, brilliant, radical, and ultimately tragic failure, an unfinished revolution. And its failure set the stage for the next 100 years of American history, a century of struggle over the exact same questions they were asking back then. What does freedom really mean? And who in the United States truly gets to be a full citizen?